Back in January, someone in an online board game group that I'm in was asking questions about this game, Pericle Gathering Darkness. I just so happened to be playing it, so I chimed in.
I've been playing it again this week. It's fun. It's a bit deeper than most app based games, Destinies, Journeys, and Middle Earth, but the app itself is probably the weakest part. The apps for the above games are much more polished. The art and interface in Pericle is pretty basic, not at all bad, but as I said, much less integrated or interesting. Also, it's not actually an app, but a website, so as far as I can tell, you have to have an internet connection to play. I've also come across a good number of typos. There's still a good bit of bookkeeping that the player needs to do, but the app tells an intriguing story. It manages skill checks, discussion prompts, and decision points. The player still needs to keep track of a character sheet, lore, and inventory, much like a D&D session. I've run into a few odd situations where encounters trigger again if you return to a spot and there's no way to know if you're supposed to fight again, or make a check again, or if the pathing is just bugged. The action dice skill system is really cool. I enjoy the rolls. It's a fairly simple system, so it keeps things quick, but still has the drama that dice bring. It's unique as far as I can tell, but it may be from another system, and I'm not actually sure. Overall, it's a really cool package, a unique and fairly deep RPG that you don't need a DM for. Really fun solo, and it only has a moderate amount of bookkeeping, and with a relatively simple dice system, it's manageable. I'm playing with 4 characters, and it hasn't been overwhelming. Worth checking out, I think, despite its quirks.
Now, that was pretty concise, and I could just end the video there, but I wanted to share that not just because Jerry Hawthorne, the designer of Mice and Mystics, responded to it, a badge of honor I will wear for a long time, but because I wanted to make a video and move beyond the blurb, the 10,000-foot level, for a good bit of time now. So without further ado, let's talk about what Pericle is, how it plays, and I'll give you some of my thoughts on it. This is Pericle Gathering Darkness.
Pericle is a party based, app powered adventure and dungeon crawling game from Long Dog Games. Crowdfunded, it delivered last year and it was touted as an RPG like D&D or My Little Pony that you didn't need a game master for.
Pericle takes place in a fantasy world and is similar to a lot of games you'll find in the genre, but it does have a few distinctions.
One of the things I love about it is that it takes place in a nautical world, very much inspired by Mediterranean civilizations. There are pirates and slavers and creatures you may find in a Greek myth, like the hero Pericles would find in a labyrinth. In fact, one of my favorite moments so far in the campaign includes a large encounter with a minotaur, who had a trap floor and a few nasty surprises waiting on every hex. So, with the game's name being what it is, it should not come as a surprise that it reminds you of Greek and Roman tales. But I really like this theme. It's similar to a lot of other fantasy games with swords and spells and lots of items to find, dungeons to explore, but with a bit of a twist. I think the theme of Pericle stands out. I'm not going to go into too many details in case you want to play the game for yourself, but you start off as a group of prisoners who are thrown into an arena and begin their journey to gain independence. The arena fight here serves as your tutorial, and although Pericle's app does this odd thing where it embeds YouTube videos in its interface, making it a little clumsy to click around, it is a simple enough way to learn the game's systems. Although you may want to thumb through the rulebook once before you dive in, as the systems are fairly deep. For me, it had a few unique rules that I didn't have experience with before Pericle, and reading the book ahead of jumping in was helpful. And speaking of learning to play, let me take you through Pericle's unique dice system. Combat rolls and choices made outside of combat use a D10, a 10-sided dice, and this action dice system may not be a completely new system as far as I know, but it's unlike anything I've experienced so far in a game, and I really enjoy it. When you go to make a roll as the app tells you, or if you're trying to make an attack within a combat scenario, you roll that action die. This dice includes 5 target symbols, which will be an automatic success, and you also have the opportunity to have a critical success or a complete miss. Characters can also upgrade their skills to help a success occur. The other faces of the action die are numbered 1 to 4. When the app instructs you to check a particular skill, like Scoundrel when you're sneaking or Athletics when you're trying to jump over something, you roll the action die. If you roll a success, this roll is completed. But if you roll one of the numbers, you need to check to make sure any multipliers are going to affect it. If you roll lesser or equal to your value in a skill, plus or minus any other modifiers that Pericle tells you to take into account when rolling a check, you succeed.
When the app tells you that there are modifiers to a particular skill check, this is Pericle's way of illustrating the factors surrounding that check you're trying to make. An example of this would be if you're making a scoundrel check, but it's nighttime. You could add +1 or +2 to it depending on how easy the game wants to make this particular check. I like that there are lots of ways to succeed by just rolling the dice. There's not a ton of math you need to do. It makes skill checks and combat rounds go a little bit quicker. Another thing that could modify a skill check is particular items. Say you're trying to break open a box, but you found a crowbar earlier. Well, then it would simplify that check as well. It's a great system.
Most of the time, these skill-based checks will take place outside of combat, but there are a few instances within a combat encounter that requires a roll like this as well. So let's take a look at what a typical encounter within Pericle might look like. This is really where the depth of Pericle shines. There is really a rich system here, and it's one of the strongest parts of the game. When you begin an encounter because you decided to throw down instead of talking, Pericle's app will give you instructions on how to set up an encounter. Most of the time, this will include 1 or 2 tiles and enemies that you'll face. The setup screens will also tell you about interactable items on the map that you're placing. These may include crates to provide you some cover, a trellis to climb and find better cover on, or perhaps a lever to pull, which can only lead to good things.
If you've watched any of my League of Dungeoneers videos, you know that this is 100% true. Always pull levers in dungeons.
Once you have things set up, it's go time. Let's dive into how combat is going to work.
Are you ready? Buckle up, because it's about to get meaty. I don't know why I used that word.
Once the stage is set, heroes and enemies take turns based on their initiative. And right at the offset, Pericle creates a really interesting strategic decision. See, unlike other initiative games, Pericle lets you decide whether you move first or your enemies move first. It's halftime at the Greco-Roman Magic Bowl, and you've got a decision to make. This is a really nice layer, especially due to how restrictive the movement can be in Pericle, but we'll get to that in a moment. You can take the first move, get into a better position, and ready yourself for what's to come. Or you can be reactive, see what the enemies do, and move into a more advantageous position afterwards. If they trap you, however, you're going to be limited in what you can do. It's a risk and reward system that's really interesting, and I like it a lot. Once you've decided who moves first, you then take move actions. Ones you choose if the party's going first, and if the monsters are moving, you follow the directions that the app tells you to. Each of these individuals has a set movement they can use based on their movement score, and this can be altered by disciplines, which are Pericle's version of the level up talents, magical items, as well as spells. If you're already embattled or engaged in combat, then you can only pivot one space, and you must remain adjacent to all the embattled party members. Much like a Greek phalanx, you are tied to the combatants you are next to, be they friend or foe. Now, if movement felt like a robust salad and even borderline overwhelming, wait until you see these actions. The actions. Have no fear, though, Pericle offers you this: a flowchart of decision points based on the position you purposefully, or not, put yourself into. If you are embattled, the actions you can choose on your turn are defend, an action that grants you a defense dice that you can roll when you're attacked. You can attack with a melee weapon or a thrown weapon that you have prepared. You can attempt to grapple, which is a little bit like doing your taxes. We'll talk about that in a second. You can cast a spell. You can withdraw from a foe, which allows you to move just one space in any direction. You can change weapons or a shield. You can pick up a dropped weapon. You can fetch a potion or a torch. You can drink a potion or light a torch. You can stand up. It's a lot. It's nice to have so many options, and even though the options fill an entire page, it's pretty straightforward, except for grappling. Never grapple. Just don't grapple. It's not worth it.
Grappling a foe. Grappling is an attempt to tackle a foe by entering its hex. Number 1, roll an opposed grapple check. Compare the grapple score of both the combatant and the foe. The higher score gets to make the grapple check. If it's a tie, the combatant rolls. The AD for the grapple check is the difference between the grapple scores of the combatant and the foe. For example, if the combatant has grapple 3 and the foe has grapple 2, the combatant will roll an AD 1 grapple check. Because 3 minus 2 is 1. Thank you, Pericle. 3, if the combatant is rolling and the check is successful, the grapple succeeds. If the foe is rolling and the check is successful, the grapple fails. 5, grapple success. Both fall prone in the foe's hex. The combatant may then immediately make an attack to deal damage with a weapon that can be used in said grapple. Simple.
There are separate lists of things of what you can do in a grapple pile, which is where you are if you're laying down on top of a bunch of other standees. It's funny because every time I play with one, I just picture a tumbling pile of cartoon characters and a plume of smoke grasping for the last cookie or something. The few changes to this list include being able to use a really close quarter weapon like a dagger, a knife, or your bare fist. You can attempt to cast a spell, which becomes harder because the target gains a defense die automatically. Because to be fair, if you're grappling someone and you are right in their face, they could see that Avada Kedavra coming from a mile away. Just call yourself the broadside of a barn, except for the whole defense thing. Anyway. Well, and that's it for actions. Except it isn't. Remember how I mentioned movement really sets the tone for each round as it is limiting to the actions you can take? Well, that's even more so the case because there are certain actions that are only available to you if you only move one space. This is basically a pivot move. In fact, if you move your full movement, you cannot use a ranged weapon for your action or cast a spell, so you have to think really carefully about what position your ranged characters are in. Most other options are forbidden after moving your full movement as well, apart from attacking with a melee weapon, moving again, or a few other things. Now, I've spent all this time on actions because I wanted to highlight one of Pericle's strengths. It really is one of the deeper app-based games out there, especially in its combat systems. And even though I poke fun at how much there is to do, this game's robust combat system is trying to feel like an RPG. And these actions that you can take on your turn are not far off from what you might find in a pen and paper system. It's nice that there's such a deep and strategic system here. Having an app is also really nice when it comes to enemy AI. You don't have to second guess priority or behavior. The app just tells you what each enemy is going to do during their action phase. It's nice and has some backup plans if there aren't valid actions to take. Just make sure that you have the right situations clicked in the app so their behavior is going to be accurate. Because honestly, undoing in the app is a nightmare. In what I have seen on Pericle, the encounters are pretty diverse, ranging from small party encounters, boss fights, and even some larger encounters that include enemies that there aren't standees for, which that one was honestly one of my most memorable because it did something a little different and was a little puzzly, and it used cubes for a large number of bat-like enemies, but again, I'm not going to go too deeply into it because I want you to experience the game for yourself if it's something you want to do. The components in Pericle are nice, if not a bit understated. The art for the standees has somewhat of a hand-drawn look, and most of the fantasy rogues gallery is here. Trolls, harpies, goblins, some woodland threats, and even some sea creatures, which again are a nice addition, solely based on the theme of the game. All of these have a somewhat simple quality, and that's not a criticism. There's an overall scrappy nature to this game, to everything in Pericle, and with the solid bones of the actual gameplay, it holds together well. Although overall I would say that the tiles are a bit less impressive in terms of the art, but they still get the job done. After a combat ends, you can rest, meaning you can recover some of your exhaustion. Oh, by the way, exhaustion is a temporary HP loss that you can get back in between fights. Most of the spells any of your characters are going to use will gain exhaustion. There's an initial cost and there's also an upkeep cost every turn. So you have to think carefully about how long you want a spell effect to last. I get into this a little later in some of my criticisms, but I wish there was a way that you could just click a rest button, much the way you can just decide to rest at any point in Dungeons & Dragons. The game seems to not know exactly how much freedom it wants to give you, telling you at times that you have a place that you can go back to at rest, but also then telling you can only rest after encounters. There are some story beats that say, okay, now this is the full rest moment, and there are other times again where it says you can come back here and rest. And it's a little tricky to navigate which you're allowed to do and when. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm playing on an easier mode because I'm a filthy casual, and replaying things over and over again is the definition of not fun to me. But hey, to each his own, and it's nice that there are options here. If a party member is knocked out in combat, you can just have them pop back up to 1 HP and try the encounter again if you fail. But with the haziness on how and when you can rest at times, you really want to make sure that you have healing potions on you because your characters aren't just going to pop back. They're going to need to heal because another strange thing about Pericle is sometimes it feels obvious when day is over, and other times it's been encounter after encounter after encounter. And this variation in the length of the day makes it feel a little confusing about when and how your party members can get back to their fighting shape. Once you rest after an encounter, the app continues the story, tells you where you can go, what you can do next. You make choices and checks along the way.
Before I dive too deep into some critiques about the game, here's some other things I wanted to highlight about it.
If you happen to come across a store in the game, the app tells you what is available to buy with gold that you find in your adventures. There are scrolls and potions and other RPG fare available, as well as more gear that can also be found by interacting with certain searchable elements in the maps. Many of the stores have their inventory available in the booklet. Another common RPG element is here as well in bookkeeping. There are things to keep track of, like carry weight, other rewards for combat you have to keep track of. The game isn't going to do this for you.
Another big part of Pericle is leveling up. Once you gain XP, you can periodically use that XP to gain disciplines. These are the game's traits that your characters can take on. Some of my favorites that I've taken are meditate after combat as part of a rest. You may recover additional exhaustion. You can also have a parry. So when you're using a shield type of weapon, you gain a +1 armor bonus against melee attacks. There's a large list of them, and they're great.
There's a decent number of choices here, and with the tiers that are included in some of them, there are a lot of ways to customize your party and its characters. Speaking of characters, there are some pre-made characters in the main box of Pericle, but you can also take the game's built-in character builder for a spin. This is the way the game allows you to be even more specific with your builds and backstory. Pericle has a recommended party size of 3 or 4, and I've been playing the game with 4 pre-made builds, and it's pretty manageable with this size, especially when you get the hang of combat. As far as I understand, there isn't a way to play true solo, which would be nice to see at some point, especially if you can get overwhelmed by managing multiple characters. It'd also be nice if you could just change the difficulty and have the game adjust encounters the way that, say, Journeys in Middle-earth does.
One last thing that I really like about Pericle is that it includes some of these secret envelopes. And a lot of campaign games do something like this. But gosh, nothing beats when the app tells you you can finally open one of those envelopes you've been staring at in the box for session after session. Nothing beats that feeling. Yeah, I just love it.
Unfortunately, the app is mostly utility. Sure, it includes some art, but in most screens you're treated to walls of text and stat blocks. Some stages are set by videos and VO, but these are few and far between. And when they do appear, you are treated to just a few minutes of moving images. There's no actual animations here. The app itself, though it's technically an application, it's really just a website. So there's no option to play integrated with iOS or other mobile devices as far as I know. The biggest drawback, however, to Pericle's digital GM is quite predictably its lack of human brain. Pericle does a respectable job as a guide for its world, story, and combat, but the lack of spontaneity is fairly obvious, and its limitations become glaring when faced with what a true RPG would inevitably allow you to do. In a traditional RPG, especially in today's climate surrounding the hobby, Humor, improv, and trying weird things play a huge role in the role playing game. Without the ability to be spontaneous, I can't help but feel a little disappointed in what Pericle offers. If that's what you're looking for, you won't find it here. And it's not really Pericle's fault that it can't answer those parts of what an RPG is and can be. No game really can. But I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I went into this a little bit when I was talking about resting after an encounter, but here's a little bit more of a deep dive of the difficulty I had with knowing what to do. After getting through a few encounters and being thoroughly spent, I knew that my party needed to go back to our hub and rest. This is after the game told me that, hey, you can go back to this specific place and rest. In a tabletop setting, you would just tell your GM that you're going back to rest. But in Pericle, I wasn't sure if I could just do that or I needed to just tell the app. There wasn't a way to do this, so I ended up undoing a few screens to get back to the rest place and then traversing a cave again, only to be greeted by the encounter that had just beat me down in the first place. So I ended up just ignoring this encounter instead of fighting it again. I was torn though. I wasn't sure if the game wanted me to fight the same group of enemies in this cave over and over again in order to get back to where I was in the story, but to not be just completely party wiped if I did so. Should I have just rested and then not told the app? Am I only allowed to rest when the app tells me to? Do I fight again if I backtrack? Do I skip an identical encounter? I really wasn't sure what the best way to proceed was. A human would be able to tell you what to do. And in this area, the limitations of the app are pretty obvious. In fact, most choice moments boil down to a binary decision. Stealth or not. Be a jerk or not. There isn't a ton of nuance here. None of this is necessarily Pericle's fault, and I would rather reserve judgment for what Pericle is instead of what it isn't, but I thought it would be worth mentioning since it's such a big part of the promotional identity. As a self-guiding, tactical combat game, Pericle succeeds. But I wouldn't go so far as to call it the dream GM-less RPG that so many people these days are trying to make.
So there you have it, a look at Pericle Gathering Darkness. And it really is an impressive box. There's a whole lot of content in there, and you can tell that the team really loves RPGs, really loves the tabletop experience. And despite its limitations, I think it does a lot of things really, really well. It's a lot of fun, a lot of content for the money. And I mentioned it in one of the little notes that I put on the picture of the Minotaur in the video, that there is an expansion on its way. I backed it. I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more monster variety. I'd like to see more maps and more locations and stuff. But if you made it this far through the video, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for taking the time. I really enjoy making these deep dive videos. They're really time consuming. I've been working on this one for about a month, and I have pretty limited equipment and time, but I do like them. So let me know if you like this kind of long form essay style content for the game. I'm going to dive into League of Dungeoneers again next, go back to it and see what the second edition stuff and the expansion there has to offer. But I think this video will kind of be the first in a series. I want to make a series of videos called like Dungeon Files or something like that, because I play a lot of dungeon crawlers and I'd like to compare and contrast them and recommend them based on their strengths, so you can see if you like them. But thank you so much for watching. I'm so happy that the channel has built a little community around this type of game. I hope to expand more and do more videos when I can. But I appreciate everyone, appreciate every comment, like, and subscribe. But thank you so much, friends. We'll see you next time on Save Your Game.